take this opportunity to welcome you to our 10th session of the Thought Leadership for Systems Transformation Program 2022. So feel welcome and feel at home. I do welcome the teacher, Mich Levy. It's now your time. You can go on and proceed and take us through the session.
Thank you very much. I actually want to start by just saying thank you. And before I even get myself into this virtual room with you all, I want to bring with me Dan Solaf, who is a person who mentored me when I began this journey and encouraged me on it. And I want to make sure he's here with me and name him. And I want to thank Fyodor and Julius and the co-hosts and all of the participants for engaging this process. It's been thrilling to be a part of these gatherings in lots of different ways. And I really consider this a gift to be able to be in this conversation with y'all. And I have to say that it's also been a real stretch for me in terms of the ideas and trying to bring them forward in this context. So we'll see how it goes. I really appreciated the narrative and the engagement in that form and format and the content. The framework that I'm coming from, I call We Tip the Balance. It's an attempt to distill and to learn in the process theories and strategies emerging from contemporary thought and social movement. And it's a way of thinking about and engaging in social change that honors and studies the history of social struggle and centers contemporary forms of social struggle as reference points. So it means that I'm not trying to make stuff up or have answers. I'm trying to work with what I see and what I see as important and vital to this moment, and to try to glean from it with others what it is that we can be learning together, and from people who are on the front lines, in the forefront, doing work that they deem necessary from where they're standing, and that therefore we can connect to, observe, learn from, etc. It also means that one of the things I want to do in this conversation always is to try to locate myself as a learner, not only because I think we all have so much to learn, but because one of my hopes is that as we're learning from each other and with each other, that we're practicing the idea of not knowing, and that we practice that kind of growing together because we have so much of it to do. So if I, for example, say something that is more US specific or US centric than necessary, or something that feels useful to build on and improve and expand, I would hope that people would say something and that we could do that together. For me, kind of the core of what I offered in the materials is around this idea of what is paradigm change and what does it look like, how is it structured, what's possible to learn about the process that we're in. And one way to think about that that's less concrete than where I'm headed is that the material we're working with is the context, actually. It's not content, that the material, quote unquote, is the context and the ways that we discover or learn to use it in order to access and practice new content. That we need new vocabulary, we need new practices, new institutions. What does it look like to get there? And that means us trying to make sense of where we are, but not necessarily in language or practices that we come from. That means also that in the particular ways that we're located as individuals, as groups, as collectives, that we're looking to those who know their own particular context for insight and leadership about what needs to be done, what roles we can play from our own location in order to work with them toward those ends, and where to put resources that have been historically and systemically misallocated in order to achieve those ends. So those are all ways that we can be kind of exploring. However, this is not a theoretical endeavor. In preparing for today. I think a lot of times I try to really stay calm and present and do what's in front of me. And in the act of preparing for today, I had this wave of clarity and urgency about the next 2 years in the United States. Concretely, what's going to happen here politically in the next 2 years. And I had a wave of this when 44 and a half became president of this country, the wave of visceral awareness of what was coming hit. And I feel another wave of that right now. I think that we have a very short amount of time in this country to make some pretty real shifts, and that we're going to be feeling that in different ways as November elections come up and as 2024 elections come up. Obviously, that's about here on a national level, and there are lots of other frameworks or lots of other contexts or levels that we could talk about. But I do think that I'm naming it because oftentimes I try to think of change in terms of the very short term of what can be done right now, or the very long term around where we're headed. And I actually try to keep my head out of the midterm because I don't think that it's particularly useful in this moment of paradigm shift. However, in between now and then is a kind of fire that I think we need to walk through collectively. And what the kind of reaction from the right is that is being stirred in this country, and the levels of violence we've seen over the last couple of years and over the last couple of weeks. I want to name and credit Kali Akuno with some of that analysis. He's the co-director of Cooperation Jackson, which is the work that I did, that the case study is about. And I have had the honor of working with him on joint struggle issues around Palestine. And the seriousness with which he offers an analysis is really useful to me. I also want to frame the rest of the discussion with a quote from someone that has really shaped my thinking, the late Emanuel Wallerstein, who passed in 2019 and was a founder of World Systems Analysis. And I actually won't read the quote, but what I will say is that he pinpoints this moment. And he talks about it as a moment of social disintegration, not progressive change, that is coming to be seen as normal. And that it's a time when people are looking for protection, but that they don't see a state to turn to for that in a lot of ways. And they're turning to group solidarities of all different kinds. And he just kind of names how different a moment that is from where we've come, and that it's one that is very unstable. We shall surely not be able to navigate this period very well if we are unclear about the fact that none of the ideologies, that is, the agendas for political action that have governed our actions for the last 200 years, are very serviceable for the coming period. Disorder is not necessarily worse or better than order. However, it requires a different mode of action and reaction. So that's the kind of hard context in which I engage some of these questions. I feel like we are much closer to that moment than when I started this work 30 years ago, or 2 years ago, or 7 years ago, depending on when you count from. There were questions in the narrative that people offered when they looked at some of the materials I put out about how do we figure out by doing, and how do we name this paradigm shift, and how do we create images for it. And I have ideas about some of those things, but based on what I just said, I'm going to offer that, yes, we figure it out by doing, and through conversations like these and explorations like these, opportunities like these, and that what we call it or how we envision it comes out in the wash. And it's not where I'm going to focus now, but it is part of the work. And I'll offer some pieces just kind of as I go, but I'm not going to address it directly. since I put the materials out, I've actually continued to evolve the model that I offered. The way that I'm thinking about a model for what I'm calling the elements of cultural production, meaning moving from current politics to a politic in which we are more capable of producing the culture that would produce the society and the way we order our lives together, that is one we might choose over the one we have. One of the exciting things about being learners, learning beings, having an awareness of our own knowledge is that we can study how do we learn. And so there's a model of the ways that we work, how we take in information, what we do with that information as we reflect on it and assess it, and then how that information and those assessments inform our actions. However, when we're working in a political context, it's not useful, I don't think, to look at ourselves collectively as learners without the context, without the political context of how our lives are ordered. And in the model, I do include how we learn as a way to understand both our individual and collective relationships to our world, but not outside of the context of two limiting factors, one being institutional power and the other being ideology and other collective unknowing, other ways that we don't know, which could include our epistemologies, the relationships to individual, collective, intergenerational trauma, limited definitions of power, all the different kinds of ways that we can not know the world around us or even our relationship to it, one could argue. So institutional power serves as a positive feedback loop. It serves as a way to feed very real forms of state power and violence, various kinds of institutional power, embedded relations of power, vigilante power and violence. And likewise, ideology has such a force over our political lives. I would argue that the story we're trying to bust out of in this paradigm shift is built on a rational, individualistic worldview that we can know everything we need to know, which creates fissures between self, other, and the world around us. And I hang on to that for myself because I think that the relationship between self and other is a way that helps me to understand. It's like a lens, and I can look through our sciences, our histories, and see how that relationship to self and other could shift in a paradigm. When it shifts paradigm and our relationship between self and other shifts, then those sciences also shift, those politics also shift, etc. So the really specific piece that I want to hang on to here is, I would argue that the relationship between self and other that has shaped our world, our liberal conceptions of individualism, scarcity, property, knowledge, education, how learning happens, who can know stuff, how change happens, that liberal, progressive ideologies where I am grounded here show up as liberalism and show up politically in different ways in different places, but that are based on this kind of progressive model and have become the foundation of the liberal democracy that has been coupled with capitalism and global capital as it has done its thing in all corners, is something that has this kind of, this structure between how we operate and power and ideology serving as positive and negative feedback loops respectively. And that structure can stay this theoretically, that structure is something that we might not be able to overcome. But what is possible potentially to overcome, what I'm exploring, is the idea that if we change the definitions of power to reflect the culture that we would want to be living in, and if we're able to shift the ideological foundations or relationship between self and other that is underpinning those negative feedback loops, that this structure and function of those pieces can stay the same, but the structure of our culture and in how our lives are ordered together could potentially shift. So where it heads is questions that people were asking around what are some new forms of power that could emerge or are already emerging that need to be codified. I'm going to take about 10 minutes more, so I'm just going to throw out some ideas around power and ideology that came up in people's questions. And I'm not going to address some of the questions maybe around paradigm shifts themselves, and maybe we can talk about that after. I would like to spend a couple minutes on the practice of it, because that's what actually matters. So when we're looking at new definitions of power, there's so much to talk about. I'm just going to throw out a couple of ideas. One is that Audre Lorde has a way of talking about power in which it is the ability to seek new ways of being in the world. And I hold on to that. I find that incredibly useful. What are forms and kinds of power that provide the ability to seek new ways of being in the world? So some thoughts around that are that, for example, alongside this power, this all-powerful ability to know, alongside the power of knowing, the power of also seeing the limitations of our own ability to fully know is one of the ways to acknowledge and account for ideology, even if we're not able to address it directly. More materially, perhaps, new forms of power would require learning to trust living in a world where one is not protected by the violence of state power, but by an accountability built into negotiated power. And that's something that obviously takes an enormous amount of practice and work to become possible and is probably never finished. Kinds of power that are already being practiced in so many places are different forms of municipalism, mutual aid, union building. There are lots of kinds of organizing, which would need to be coupled with mass organizing on a scale that we could talk a lot about, given the context that I laid at the beginning. There are lots of examples of mass organizing that have emerged just over the last couple of years that Kali, for example, argues lay a groundwork that can be built on in powerful ways, all the way from Occupy to mutual aid practices during COVID to the rebellions of 2020, that there's a lot of infrastructure already, for lack of a better word at the moment, built there to build on. One last idea that I think is interesting around thinking about power in different ways is, what does it mean to subsume power or diffuse power? When the multiplicity of communities, municipalities, regions, neighborhoods, states, when this multiplicity of organizing transnationally across borders, when that complexity emerges, how could we try to understand what it does to power that doesn't serve us? And so diffusing or subsuming are ways that I think about those things. I also think that there's some real value in taking the kind of violence that happens on a personal level, whether it's bullying or domestic violence, and looking at how do those kinds of power get challenged in our own lives, and what does that look like on larger scales? In what ways is it valuable to translate at those levels? I'm going to switch to the idea of ideology. You know, in the narrative that people offered to me, there was this really great idea of recognizing capitalism and human-centeredness as our core dominant ideologies. And I appreciated them so much in that like the way that they were described, that it was so useful. That's very much about real experience. And I would put into that discussion that I personally think that progressivism is a bigger container that capitalism can sit in. I would argue that capitalism isn't an ideology, and that human-centeredness works as an ideology for me, and that it could sit inside of an ideology, a kind of ideology with a capital I, that liberalism is a dominant force in creating and facilitating the kinds of examples that were given. So I don't offer that because I feel like wordsmithing or semantics are important. I offer it because liberalism shapes our politics. And for me, I think it's a strategic way to keep our eye on the prize of what does it mean to not just have political change, but to actually transform politics, to have politics become something that serves us because it needs to, because our economics need to be grounded in politics, not the other way around, because we need to be able to engage with each other and order our lives together in productive, healthy, regenerative ways. And for me, I explain that through politics, not necessarily through the other great pieces of that were named and described. So that's a hot topic for me. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily whatever. I'm going to leave it there for now. And so I actually have a few minutes left, and I'm going to take a moment and pick and choose. People ask some really interesting questions around how do paradigm shifts work in some of kind of like we're talking about it as if it happens all the time, just kind of this idea of a paradigm shift. What am I trying to say? So I think what I'm going to do is talk about practice and then come back to that stuff with any time I have left. So in terms of trying to think about this idea as something useful, not just talking about what does it mean in practice, I had a couple of different ways to think about it. One is to just share that one of the ideas I'm thinking about, one of the things that this gathering actually raised for me, is a question of what are the politics of systems transformation? What are the kinds of politics that emerge when we talk about this? And I have a list of them that I came up with, but that's something that I think is a useful question in this context. Another thing that really came up around practice is this question around activism. What is it? Activism versus post-activism. I think they're really valid questions, kind of in the bigger sense of how even the practice historically, we could argue that just even the practice of social change itself has taken on new meaning, and that people have different definitions of what social change means, and that there are historical reasons for that. I asked a real question inside the kind of in the process of our gathering around how is the term of post-activism, does it have pluses and minuses? Does it potentially put up an unnecessary barrier between people who are considering themselves post-activists and people who consider themselves activists, when there's a real opportunity for bridging there, to use a term from John A. Powell and the Othering and Belonging Institute. But the real issue for me around this is the importance of activism versus organizing. I don't think that activism can get us where we need to go outside of the critical need for organizing. That if I understand activism as getting up and doing something, coming out to do something in public, aligning my actions with my values, it has an ability to kind of sink back into liberal practices around individualism, and doesn't assume that we need to be doing those things together as a political act. And organizing, for me, requires vision, it requires strategy, it requires commitment. So I would make that distinction. And then to focus on strategy, people offered some really great questions around, or how questions, which I feel like has come up for us through all of our through so many of our conversations. How questions of collective processes that can move us away from struggles toward cultural production, such as how can we transcend these barriers and discover new ways of being together? How do we work with these institutions and other critically important stakeholders, especially given the little time we have to deal with existential threats of global proportions? How do we actually connect change that is happening locally with change that we need globally? How can we call out mechanisms that keep us bound by the old paradigm? And I posted a document, which maybe could be posted with this recording, that speaks to kind of assessment and planning and short-term, long-term, and suggested criteria. And I think that the kind of summary version of that document is that the answer is by organizing. Organize, organize, organize. We need to find our people and see what that work is that is directly in front of us to do. And I think that, for example, it opens up real conversations about the politics of abolition here in this country, the politics of reparations. How is it that people who organize and all of the activism that's being done around abolition reflects the same principles, values, goals as a paradigm shift, and being able to transform our culture, not necessarily by growing an institution into something that serves differently, but by allowing our culture to shape and inform the way that needs get met and the ways that a regenerative society and culture allows us to be here and thrive together. So I will stop there. People asked about case studies. I can also put that in something to include, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michi. Now it's time for question and answers. So kindly type your question in the chat. I've already seen there's one question there.
Thank you. I work with very disempowered people and hoping to maybe teach these principles to them at a very young age so that when they grow up, they have, this is their natural kind of thought. But how, as a disempowered person, even personally, like what would you cultivate in them if you just really are not able to participate in any level of power? Those are the people that I work with. And then as well, how do I'm basically their teacher, but what would you suggest to how to teach them or how to be or what to, I want to take these concepts to them, even very young, for them to be able to think differently about their situation, about their tribe, about the systems that they are in, but on a very personal level.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like my gut reaction is there are not disempowered people. I don't think that's useful. I understand what you are trying to say in the relations of power that you're seeing that are kind of eliciting that language. I would offer that there are so many circumstances that so many of us are in that we can all be in one way or another, in which we don't have access to political power, perhaps in the way that you're thinking of. But for example, you just take the most extreme examples. An incarcerated person, a person who doesn't have their own freedom of movement. There's so much power in the choices that are made. And there is organizing done in this country from inside of prisons, and they lead their own movement. And the people in solidarity are on the outside and they follow. Really trying to think about what is the power that each of us has and how do we grow that with each other. So I am an educator in my paid work, and every single person that comes through my door has that for themselves, and we love them together and we build with each other. And I can say that I had the privilege of having access to a formal education, and it was the people who were around that did that with me, that wanted to share my brain with me, that asked me what I was thinking and feeling, that wanted to know because they felt like it was important. That's where it starts for me. That's where it started for me. One of the places anyway.
Thank you. That's helpful.
You talked a lot about US context and about liberalism. In the peer learning session, we discussed how global institutions and also institutions in many places in the world are bound by the same ideology or are based on the same ideology. But also, I wonder if you see any places in the world or any communities or any societies that are not corrupted by liberalism, or they're not based on liberalism at any significant scale, because liberalism hasn't been with the humanity forever, right? They were alternative models, alternative ideologies, right? Maybe there are, even though we live in a globalized world, maybe there are places where you see alternatives thriving or at least surviving.
I mean, I think that from my perspective here, I've been in the US for a while now, meaning I had kind of broader perspectives at other times in my life, but I have been here for a while now. And what I see most of is the practice of cultural survival of cultures that have not been taken over by liberalism, that have not been incorporated into the global economy in ways that others have, and really understanding in a way that for those of us whose culture is defined by liberalism, even if only predominantly, and there are other complexities, of course, the idea of cultural production may seem awkward or new or something. But for those who have been in practice of cultural survival for, depending on who you're talking about, might be a shorter period, it might be a very long period. It's not a new idea. And so holding on to, not only holding on to, but just in the last recent decades, people here reestablishing languages, learning the languages of their, maybe not even their mother, but their grandmother, going back and holding on to, recreating, refounding in cultures from which they have come, I think is the biggest example I can think of. One of the things that has struck me was someone gave a definition of indigeneity as knowing where you come from. And that idea of basing oneself in those people and places that we come from, I think is one of the places to find leadership. What are possibilities for difference? What are possibilities for other ways of doing things that have been more productive over time, or differently productive in different places, or specifically relevant, etc.?
Yeah, I also like, first of all, is to say the work of Mich is so inspiring, especially in our context. Like Kenya, we are having election in a month's time. So I was trying to reflect your work into the current political situation in Kenya. And maybe just to ask you, do you see any kind of relation from your work on the political sphere to the current political which is happening in developing world, especially say in the African countries, where politics is like rated something high of great value, people even die for?
I think that one of the things that has really become very apparent for me in the conversation that we've been in through this gathering is the crucial importance of politics on the continent of Africa. Africa-wide, across the board, what are the relations of power that are being played out? It's a no-brainer. Really, what I want to say is that over the next decades, it's become much more clear to me the level of impact that African leadership is going to be playing internationally. And so let me answer you this way, Julius. When I was thinking of examples, the examples that we've heard from Kenya and Uganda, they work for me in the way I think about it. I think that the kinds of work that Cleo and Ignatius are doing, for example, where they are taking an analysis and a vision around what is required, around how food can be thought about. How can self-sufficiency be thought about? How does self-determination over access to food transform the economy? How does political power get localized and diversified through that work? And it manifests in a totally different way in the SAIDS project. That project is also based on this kind of how is power addressed? What kinds of shifts around our access to knowing need to occur? What kind of ways do we need to think about our own power and our own blind spots, our own lack of access to political power? How does that get shifted through practice? And I think it would be really interesting to maybe take one or both of those and play them out in the model the way that the case study. I don't like calling it a case study because it's not a case study. It's a real project and real lives, and it's a real work that is grounded. It's not like an example of something. It's something very important that's being done that we can look at. And I think that it's interesting to think about doing that with other projects.
Thank you, Michi, for your wonderful work. Very much appreciate. Now it is time for you to be able to give us closing remarks.
All of the concerns we're facing now, I didn't know exactly what they would look like or feel like. I didn't really know how real it would be in my lifetime, but all the writing was on the wall when I was 12 years old. And I knew it. I have been asking these questions all of my adult life. And here we are. And I ask them in all humility in the practice of knowing that I believe that this is our work together, is to learn how to become together. That unless we learn how to do this, we might not be able to do it. And we do learn by doing. In the last couple of years, my doing has changed a lot. And I haven't known what we tip the balance is, but I've known that I won't know what we tip the balance is until I do it. And so I ask myself, what am I supposed to be doing right now? And I try to do those things. And the more that I can do them with you, that would be the way I would want it. And so I say that as an invitation, and I mean it. Anyone who wants to contact me and be in this conversation with me, maybe help me get more grounded, maybe help me make more sense, maybe tell me why I'm crazy. I would love to be in the conversation with you. So thank you so much.